Green Rush, Mining the Energy Revolution with Matt Watson.
Hello and welcome to Green Rush, Mining the Energy Revolution. I'm your host, Matt Watson. Thank you for joining us. Each week we'll dive into a different metal and a different clean energy transition topic to highlight how these metals are growing in demand. This week we're taking on the topic of environmental, social, and governance, ESG, and talking about this in the context of scaling responsibly mined minerals, critical minerals, as we meet this onslaught. So today we're going to have two panelists. First is a friend of mine from New York, James Gavilan, Principal Advisor at Gavilan Commodities, LLC. Jimmy, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Matt. It's great to be here. I wish you all the best in this show. I know this is your first few episodes, so happy to support it, and hopefully you'll get a couple Emmys down the road.
Oh, yeah. There we go. Also, a second panelist I have joining us this week, one of the smartest guys I know in this space that can actually talk intelligently about some of the ESG issues, especially in the nickel space, Mr. Lyle Trytten, president of Trytten Consulting Services from Alberta, Canada region. Right, Lyle? How you doing, sir?
Thanks, Matt. Pleasure to be here. Love to talk about nickel and cobalt and all the other critical minerals and how we get responsible projects brought forward.
All right. Well, let's start with the softball question for both of you guys. What is ESG? Explain to a layman what ESG means to them in the context of mining. Jimmy, why don't you go first?
Sure. From my point of view, obviously, we know the main letters revolving around ESG, environmental, social governance. What it means to me, I think I'd say for the mining community that we interact with, it's coming from the finance world. It's how do we operate in a way that opens us up to pools of capital, to funds that are focused on ESG. And of course, the mining world has been involved in all three of these aspects of ESG for as long as time, right? We've always had to be responsible operators. We've always had to demonstrate back then corporate social responsibility. So for me, when I meet with investors and with mines, it's about how do you embrace this movement, which is now a movement, right? It started out as a nuisance and a bit of a cost, but now we're seeing alpha associated with ESG. So to me, it means liquidity. It means continuing responsible operating, and especially it means pivoting and opening yourself up to this clean energy transition, right? Because that's the key here. As you said at the top, how do we scale growth and responsibility at the same time, which can be challenging.
Absolutely. All right, Lyle, your turn. Define ESG.
Yeah, I'm going to take that a bit of a different direction. As a technical person and having worked in sustainability, environment, and engineering and these different aspects, I think about these from a bit of a different lens. The environmental perspective is super important. Of course, we've seen some really big issues in the mining industry in the last decade and going back, centuries. We're trying to get better. We are getting better, but there's a lot to think about when you deal with tailings and air pollution and water pollution and landscape changes and all these other aspects that come along with the environmental piece. On the social side, we used to think about it as communities, but really it's bigger than communities because social, you need to wrap into that how you treat your workers, how you treat your surrounding communities, and the broader society at large. And that brings in a lot of different perspectives. And then on the governance side, we've seen a bit of an evolution over the last, I'll say, 10 years or so. When we used to talk about governance in the industry, we talked really about internal governance, how decisions get made, who's at the table making decisions. But we also have to think about the external governance piece of this. Where are we working? How are we working there? Are they regimes where we're propping up dictators and warlords, or are they democratic institutions? There's a big, broad area there that is not directly within a company's control, but still very important to us to try and manage.
Absolutely. I agree. Couldn't agree more. Just to give some text to this, this right off the internet, so it's got to be true. Just the definition of ESG here. But let's jump into these points that you're bringing up. But we're gonna jump through a series of battery metals. I first like to set this discussion up, and I've talked about this on the kickoff episode. I do these roll-ups on multiple metals and looking at supply and demand. So here you're looking at basically 3 decades worth of demand in the context of the USGS the United States Geological Service, what they define as known global reserves. These are mining assets that have been well mapped out, all the drill holes completed, you know exactly what you've got in all your feasibility studies. You have a processing plan that makes sense. You have access to water, everything else. So effectively, we're going to have to consume all of our nickel and cobalt reserves between now and 2050. I'm really concerned about these rare earth elements. These are very dirty as well. So I think we want to talk about those a little bit here today as well. But, you know, we're going to be needing huge amounts of these metals. And you put this in the context of the miners, these ESG criteria appear to be adding to these timelines that these guys are challenged with. One of the big complaints you get from the mining community is, you know, even an open pit mine, 17 years typically on average from funding all the way to development of the mine and actually getting it into operation, getting it into production. And these timelines are growing. And I think it's really a concern that has been noted throughout the mining industry. And again, we're going to have the thousands of mines that we have to develop are really profound. And these ESG issues certainly are important, but they're adding to the timelines. And unfortunately, I think we're getting into a genre of metals that are dirty. And let's start with nickel. This is Lyle's favorite metal. Now, nickel, there's two different types of deposits in the world. A class 1 nickel deposit, typically a sulfide ore, that you can see, according to the IEA, generates on average somewhere between about 8 to 10 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per ton of nickel processed. Unfortunately, 60% of the globe is consumed with mostly laterite ores, where you have two paths that you can go, and Lyle can articulate better than I ever can. But you could do basically a double smelting step, a second smelting step to get rid of the iron in the nickel pig iron. The iron is not suitable for battery class nickel. In another process that's been developed by the Chinese, this is HPAL, high pressure acid leach process. This lowers the emissions substantially down to 20 to 30 tons per ton processed, which is fantastic. But with it comes a bunch of its own issues. And Lyle, I feel like I want to turn you loose on this since this is right in your backyard. You know, what is the importance of HPAL and put it in the context of Indonesia and what's going on with this nickel explosion coming from Indonesia as of late?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. And, you know, I'll just note I love that you pulled that figure. If you look at the byline on it, you'll see where the data came from. Yeah. I actually did some work for the IEA on this topic a couple of years ago. So, you know, the reality is that we need nickel from a variety of sources. We're not going to bring it all from the sulfide deposits that we have in North America and Europe. You know, that's not possible. The laterite processing, you know, and I'm going to correct you here, Matt, wasn't developed by the Chinese. It was actually developed in the U.S. Freeport developed this technology in the 50s. The first implementation was in Cuba, and that's a facility that's still running today. Second generation of facilities were in Australia around the year 2000. I helped design and start up one of those. Third generation and fourth generation we're into now in Indonesia. And what we've seen over the last 70 years of this technology is it works fine. The chemistry is good. It's solid. It's tough to keep the equipment together. And it creates a lot of challenges around handling the residues and the effluents from it. You know, the treating of laterites via nickel pig iron process or ferronickel to make alloys, you know, that's not new either. That's been around for 100 years. All these processes work, but there are very significant differences in the environmental performance of them, which really depends on what aspects you look at. Sulfides seem really benign from a greenhouse gas point of view, but the largest anthropogenic SO2 sulfur dioxide emitter in the world is a nickel smelter. It's not in Canada and it's not in Europe, but it is in Asia. Or the
I would imagine that'd be Norilsk, right?
That would be Norilsk. It's pretty easy to find the data on it. About 2 million tons a year worth of SO2 dumped straight into the atmosphere. So everyone has its challenges. Sulfide ones tend to be easier to manage from an air pollution point of view, provided you've got a reasonable location. The tailings issues with high pressure acid leach are a very significant factor because these aren't like mine tailings that we normally think of in the hard rock industry. If you grind up a sulfide ore, recover the sulfides from that, the remainder of that is ground rock, and it's relatively straightforward to deal with. High pressure acid leaching, you've got these precipitated metals out of the autoclaves that are, 2 to 10 microns in size. They're very difficult to deal with. A lot of precipitated metals that can be metastable and come back. Going the smelting route with NPI and ferronickel, the slags are pretty benign, right? So that aspect is better, but the carbon intensity is just huge from those processes, especially with coal-fired power, such as they're doing in Indonesia.
So you end up with this really fine tailing, and as I know we've discussed in the past, Lyle, managing those tailings in a region with just huge, immense rainfall and seismic activity. Tailing management is got to be a pain in the ass, right, for the HPAL tailing. And one of the things, when I was learning about all these metals, obviously you follow Elon Musk, and Elon Musk was bitching and moaning and pushing back on Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, two sites where Chinese-owned mines are doing exactly that. They're taking the mine tailings, they run a pipeline out off the coast, they run the pipe down, presumably down 1,500 meters in depth, and they release the material at the bottom of the seafloor, and it creates a cloud. There's a question about what's the ecological impact to doing that approach. It's got to be the cheapest approach on how to deal with the mine tailings, so to speak. But I'm setting aside now the discussion on ecological. How does the HPAL process end up being one of the cheapest processes in the world, Lyle? And with all these acids at play, to me that would be an expensive process.
Yeah, so the reality is that the reagents you need for HPAL are pretty cheap. Sulfuric acid or sulfur to be burned to make sulfuric acid, it's pretty cheap. Limestone's pretty cheap most places. And you get a large byproduct value out of these high pressure acid leach projects because they're typically 10 to 20 to 1 nickel to cobalt ratio. So you get quite a bit of cobalt value out of them that helps reduce your cash costs. But you're right, a lot of the reason the costs seem low is that there's things you're not paying for, right? You're not paying for environmental devastation in some places. You're not paying for tailings disposal on land in some places. I'm not an ecologist. I'm not going to say that this is a good way, that's a bad way. Tailings are a problem for our industry. Yeah. They're a necessary evil. And when you're in these areas that have high rainfall, high seismic risks, steep topographies, there are no good answers. There's a succession of bad answers. You can go very expensive, and some facilities are starting to filter tailings and pile them up. And unless you fully bury them again, that's not necessarily a forever solution. And there's still contamination issues with those, even if you bury them. Dumping them in the ocean, at least you don't have a tailings dam that's going to collapse like in Brazil. Like there's just a succession of bad answers in some physical locations.
So Jimmy, why don't you explain how this comes up in the context of your risk management, consulting services that you bring to the table? How are you dealing with clients in this space?
Well, it is interesting because the overriding force we're seeing on the investor and mining side is this sort of, critical mineral supply list, this kind of protectionist view that we learned post-COVID that you want to have security of medicine, you want to have security of minerals. So the way this is sort of manifesting is the clients that we deal with, mostly in the Western Hemisphere, they look at, for example, Indonesia with the furnace explosion that happened in Q4. They look at these type of difficult areas of jurisdiction as well as the mining technology. So the way it's relevant in our side as risk management and as investors and helping clients pivot towards pools of capital is to highlight that we're not doing this, right? So what I mean by that, we focus on, for example, nickel deposits or opportunities within the Western Hemisphere. So you're getting a little bit of that national sort of critical mineral umbrella protection, if you will. And that's only growing, right? The IRA starting to launch more programs. We're seeing continued disruptions in supply chain, still even after COVID. So these types of ideas of, tailings risk or biodiversity risk, other thematic elements to this type of mining in Indonesia and other areas it helps make the case greater when we look at clients that are operating in better jurisdictions. So a lot of this is, where are you operating? How is it that you're operating? And to your point, Lyle, is there a legacy issue if this is an M&A transaction? So we've gotten quite creative actually in using some technology and innovation with some groups that are able to sort of capture ESG metrics with imagery and satellite imagery. So we can almost go back in time, depending where the location is, to see how a mine is being remediated. Was it done properly? Is there a biohazard, biodiversity hotspot encroachment? So these themes are definitely meaningful for us in let's just call it the Americas. But for us, if anything, it helps sort of bolster the case to, hey, let's look at Canadian production, right? Let's look at somewhere else, some other jurisdictions that might either come under the IRA mandate or obviously in the critical mineral list, and then thirdly under the CSG umbrella. Where are you operating? Is it socially responsible, and so on?
Fantastic, great segue. I mean, they're using, I think it's fascinating, they're using LiDAR now where they can map these islands, which are basically these islands of nickel, which are being harvested, lock, stock, and barrel, right? And they're using LiDAR. They can see the runoff penetration rates in the water. They can compare and contrast mining sites across the globe, and they can see new events or new concerns. And there obviously have been, breaks. Some of these pipelines where they're doing the deep sea mine tailing, the pipes have broken three times, I know, in Papua New Guinea. And each time they'll coat the surrounding beaches all red. There's dead wildlife on the beach, like a baby porpoise here that green gets involved. They do an autopsy. Yeah, these animals are dying from heavy metals contamination. So I think there's concern on that front. The only other thing I've seen done with looking at some of this data with deep sea mine tailing dumping is the UN is commissioning some studies where they're doing marine biologists are looking at counts of life in these zones where they're doing the dumping. Unfortunately, they're finding zero counts. There is no life. It's a plume of nothing at that depth. So it's still a bit controversial. I do want to say, I look at this from a couple of different angles. I've been looking at the statistics on the Great Barrier Reef and its health. And strange, the past 2 years, it's gotten stronger, much, much stronger in the past 2 years where they map. And so, even though a lot of this dumping is occurring in this region called the Coral Triangle, really important to marine diversity, it's really hard to hang this as being, an evil practice. And yet there's still lots of significant concerns for the obvious reasons, to the point that Elon doesn't want to deal with them if he doesn't have to. So he's trying to avoid these particular mines, which I think is good for him. Good on him for having that ESG mindset kind of built in without being told to do it. I think that's fantastic.
You bring on.
Lyle, you want to add something?
Yeah, I was going to add. Oh, go ahead, Lyle, please.
Thanks, Jimmy. I just like to note that there's a really big difference, physically, if you're depositing tailings deep in the ocean, then you're getting almost into the same set of risk factors that you have, for example, with deep sea mining perspective, versus if you're depositing tailings shallowly or having leaks such as you've identified, where they're in the zone that is routinely used by people and fish and fish are being harvested. That's a whole different set of risk factors. So there are differences between those. But the bigger issue that I see with this is, even if you find a way that it can be done responsibly, the social side is as big a deal as the environmental side. Will people want it? To your point about Elon, do car companies, do car buyers want to know that their nickel comes from this kind of practice?
Right. No, and I don't mean to come across like we don't need the metals. Obviously, we're going to harvest the metals, but how do we do it as responsibly as possible is always the right question to be asking. Let's jump on to Cobalt. This is the one that's caught a lot of press. And I was involved in the electronics industry out here in the Silicon Valley in procurement roles and, buying a lot of cobalt and tantalum and tungsten. And ends up the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, is central to a lot of these populations of metals. The DRC is an absolute train wreck of a mess. All these regions colored in this tan color have been under militia control since the mid-90s. There's been about 6 million people that have been killed in, the strife, including about 70% of the neighboring Rwandan Tutsis. So, by the way, there's a term for that. It's called genocide. And then, of course, you get this huge population of people that are deemed by the United Nations to be living in extreme poverty, which is defined roughly as $750 a year. And yeah, so there's a huge population. It used to be back in 2016, the Congo, 90% of their population was in extreme poverty. Now it's only down to 62%.
Yeah.
That's, it's less of a horrific situation, but it's still horrific. And you can't blame the people for doing whatever they can to survive. I don't need to blame the people by any stretch, but this is a pretty messed up region. And so suddenly here comes cobalt for the batteries. Well, the good news on the cobalt is at least it's in the southern region of the country. It's outside of these militia controlled regions. That's the good news. The bad news is huge emissions impacts when you're processing the cobalt. Lyle, take it away.
Sure. Yeah, and like this came up as a really big issue following the tin, tantalum, and gold issues a decade or so ago. And I was actually working for a nickel producer when this cobalt stuff really blew up with Amnesty International reporting and stuff. And it started becoming really important to trace your supply chains. And that's super important because, most of the cobalt mined in the DRC is mined by large international companies like Glencore, like CMOOC out of China, that are able, by virtue of the size of company that they are, to manage things differently than the artisanal mining area, which is less regulated, less controlled. And you're right not to blame the people. It's a significant issue. People need to survive, and they're going to do whatever it takes. Yep. There are no good answers except driving through the supply chains to understand where things come from, how they are developed, mined, processed, etc., what the full supply chain looks like, and having that actually visible right down to the customer level. I would like to know when I buy a solar panel or an EV or, frankly, stainless steel dishes, plates, cutlery and stuff, where does that stuff come from? We have eco labels on our fridges that tell us how much energy they'll consume, but we have no information on where stuff comes from. And so, that whole impact range, cobalt, the CO2 impact, I'm less fussed about because it is a minor component in batteries nowadays. Nickel is the driver of the carbon footprint, depending on the sourcing. But overall, that whole supply chain for cobalt is fraught with trouble because unless you can trace the kilos of cobalt that you have back to where they came from, you don't know, right? You don't know actually where it came from without that tracing.
Well, what about you, Jenny? Any comments on the cobalt world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we're touching on a major point here, and that's really the artisanal mining sector, right? Which, as we know, call it anywhere from 20 to 30% of metals production globally is coming from this area, which is a huge amount of metal. And what is interesting, I grew up in the gold market, so I'll talk to this as Lyle mentioned. There's progress being made in the gold market with respect to artisanal mining and legitimizing that flow and capturing the tailings remediation. We have one client, publicly traded company called Newlox Gold Ventures. They're on Frankfurt and I believe the TSXV. And they hyper focus on artisanal mine tailings in Costa Rica, and how do we not punish the artisanal community, not disenfranchise the artisanal community? How do we actually provide innovation and technology for them to mine in a responsible manner, to have real contracts with real producers that have pockets to fund these things? So when I look at cobalt, it reminds me of gold and other metals where we're ignoring the artisanal community, right? Especially in the precious metals, there's a huge divide between large precious metals refineries and the artisanal community. And the LBMA's done some great work in bringing those communities together. But I do think when you look at cobalt, it's an extreme example. And as Lyle mentioned, the majority are large operators. So it's almost like shame on you kind of thing. Whereas every other metal, it is a larger amount of smaller miners who, to our point, may not have the technology, may not be able to afford certain safety and PPE equipment. So I think cobalt is a good example of what not to do and how we can, artisanal especially, you're helping the community and you're helping the environment at the same time. If you can give these guys and men and women some sort of chance to dig out of these, literally to dig out of these holes. So, we see this echoed in other metals, and hopefully,
Okay.
right, as we discussed, through tech, through innovation, through some other exploration, we can put less pressure on these communities.
I just dive in there on that safety aspect you raised, Jimmy. It's really important when we try to impose our Western ideas of how these things should be done on people who don't have the same background and working philosophy that we take note of that. I spent a couple of years working on the Mbatabi project in Madagascar 20 years ago. One of the things that we did when we were developing that, we went in to do our own drill program to make sure that we knew what was in the ground, not just trusting the prior owners who were responsible operators. But we flew in hundreds of pairs of work boots for the local workers that we were going to hire to work on our drill rigs because we weren't going to let them work barefoot. What we forgot was to bring in socks because these are people who live their lives barefoot. And so we were in a scramble to buy socks at whatever stores we could find in Madagascar in order to outfit the workers properly to our satisfaction and keep them safe because we didn't want people going home with half a foot. Right. Well, we couldn't just expect that they would follow our protocols. That just doesn't work when you layer that expectation from a Western lens.
Fantastic. Great conversation. Let's move more quickly here. Lithium.
Nice.
You look at the ESG set. To me, it's all about the water, right? Lithium, 60% plus of the deposits are in brines. The typical extraction and leaching process involves about 2.1 million liters of water for every ton of lithium extracted. And that poses a problem in regions with salt flats. The funny thing about salt flats is there typically is no water, especially in the lithium triangle in Chile and Argentina and Bolivia at some 12,000 plus foot elevation. Water scarcity is really a problem. I keep looking for this segment to break open. There's these development efforts on direct lithium extraction from the brines, that you go to these brines, bypass the lithium intermediates and go right to the final form, and presumably using vastly lower water requirements, potentially opening up some of these larger deposits, if you will. I don't know if either one of you has comments on lithium. Please feel free to jump in.
Sure. I won't portray myself as a lithium expert. I'm far from that. But there's a couple of things I'd bring up here. One, DLE is, it is working today. It is going to work, but it is far from a panacea because the challenging aspect from a technical point of view is that every brine is different and it has a different mix of chemicals in it. And some of them are more corrosive. Some of these brines, if you're taking them from underground, are hot. The actual separation process, it's not like you can just say, this is the process, this is the equipment, and we're just going to use this at every facility. Everyone is different.
Right.
That really brings a bit of a challenge to deploying DLE as the solution for the process. So what we're starting to see now is a resurgence in spodumene processing, which is a higher cost route, to be sure, but there are lots of deposits. And so we're seeing quite a substantial amount of work going in now into Eastern Canada. Quebec and Ontario and Manitoba have some fairly significant spodumene deposits that they're now looking to exploit. And, that's the reason Australia is the second largest producer of lithium today is spodumene. It's just a higher cost road to get there.
So let me put on my supply chain hat here. I want to hearken, Benchmark Minerals Intelligence. They do a nice chart where they show the number of mines that are needed, and whether it be lithium, cobalt, nickel. So in terms of the mine count, to me, doing the DLE and going into these salt flats with larger deposits, you can develop massive sites, fewer of them, but bigger sites that do more processing. And to me, there's a lot of value in the scalability aspect of lithium and doing it that approach, right? There's talk, it'll never happen, but in California, the Salton Sea or the Bonneville salt flats or, one of the bigger salt flats. What if you really put a significant operation around one of these, that's worth 10 other mines? There's value in that leverage that I still think that there's a place for DLE with low water requirements that can kind of bust open the lithium market faster than just the spodumene hard rock. You disagree with that, Lyle? Or?
No, absolutely. But, the issue that I see is it's not going to be like what we've seen in nickel in Indonesia of, just building the same plant over and over and over again. So it gets very repetitive. You know exactly what it's going to cost. That's how Indonesia has been so successful in nickel. It's not going to work that way for DLE and brines because every brine is different. And that's the real challenge here. It's absolutely a valid technology. We're now starting to explore it for oil field brines here in Alberta, where I live. And there's pilot plants running now. Being able to use wells that already exist sounds like a pretty good idea for getting at a resource. Right. But, getting the scale is, as you indicate, is always going to be a problem, right?
Let me get to my hot button and I'll bring Jimmy in for this one. Rare earths. Very important for the EVs. There's magnets in most all these EV motors. Certainly very important for the wind industry. You've got up to a ton of magnets in each wind turbine. And yet, and we call them rare earths. There's nothing rare about them. We have some 400 years worth of known reserves. There's plenty of rare earths in the earth's crust. But the problem with them is that they are freaking filthy. The filthiest thing I know of on the periodical table that we process, including radioactive thorium, toxic waste. You got some 2,000 tons of toxic waste processed for every ton processed. Lots of problems with the recyclability of this. Scandium, one of the 17 rare earths, it gets recycled, but not a lot of the rest of the other 16 get any recycle at all. China dominates this space. And it's another one where I view China as kind of taking the cheapest path and dirtiest path possible to basically take over this market. And kind of just the picture is worth 1,000 words. There's been lots of documentation on this Bayan-Obo mine and how they manage their tailings. They're basically taking their RE tailings and just dumping them in a lake out back it's a 6-mile diameter dead lake. It's unlined next to a population center of 2.3 million people, which for China is a small outback, but for that's 2.3 million, population center. And this is just absolutely atrocious to me how they process this. Again, very well documented. Where in the world are we standing up and saying I refuse to accept those Chinese REEs for these reasons? I just don't see it anywhere. Jimmy, tell me I'm wrong.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, we're a slave to that metal that's coming out of that very specific area of the world. So that I see on your slide, you're 90% dominance. If there's any sort of positive sign, as Lyle mentioned, right, we're talking about a series of bad decisions. That's all this call is, right? We don't have a panacea solution. It's really a portfolio approach, and so I think we'll probably end with and conclude, whether it's portfolio approach to sustainability, to metal, in this case, brine versus spodumene. But with REEs in particular, what I'm seeing, which is interesting, you were there, Matt, there are groups that are looking at this from an innovative perspective, specifically looking at REEs that are latent within the PGM recycling circuit, right, through the slags, and trying to find REEs that way. There, of course, as I said earlier, I focus on North America, South America. I've got a few clients that have REE deposits here in British Columbia. So similar to the cobalt issue, these negative environmental hits that China can just keep taking, they have the bandwidth, for lack of a better word. It is only opening the eyes of the other investors. I do agree with Lyle that I think we are getting more scrutiny on where things are coming from. Meaning we're not there like providing information, but we're there demanding it, right? I mean, some hipster in Brooklyn is having his avocado or with his man bun. He knows where his coffee was made and how many times the beans were massaged or if they were disenfranchised before they were brewed, right? So we need that same attitude with rare earths. And I think we'll get there. Unfortunately, the accelerant to this will be other disasters, right? And we know they're going to happen, right? We just saw, as I said earlier, Q4. You mentioned, Lyle, that the tailings dam burst out of Brazil. There's just going to be, unfortunately, more and more of these events. And as long as we're active in the dialogue and we keep looking at innovative solutions and really supporting what I would call good operators. So maybe it is a hard rock deposit in Canada that might not have the same sort of economic upside, but it ticks a lot of other boxes that we can't just be driven by numbers and profitability. And that's easy, right? All of us as consumers, we go to the lowest point whenever we buy for ourselves, but we really need to think beyond that. And that's generational. It'll be disaster related, unfortunately, shocks to the system. But the last comment I'll make is a lot of this stuff with innovation it's just not scalable. And that's why I think we need the portfolio approach. I make a wonderful paella. about 2-3 times a year for my family. I'm importing goods from Spain. It's a wonderful thing. But if you ask me, and I could serve maybe 20 people, but if you said, hey, go and make it for 2,000, it's not the same as just doubling the ingredient, quadrupling the ingredients, right? So I think with this type of rare earth, we need to keep looking at it. We need to keep putting pressure on China. We need to be innovative in technology, and we need to include other sources that may not be, maybe higher cost, maybe a little harder to get to, maybe a longer red tape, because the lack of not doing that is just going to be more of these negative, events.
Great. By the way, if you ever see me with a man bun, Jimmy, that's tragic. You stop me. All right.
I don't have the man bun, but I've seen him.
Yeah, Matt, just a couple of points on that. Certainly we have some decent deposits of rare earths in Canada.
Right.
Rare earths, like other commodities that are dominated by a single producer, are challenging to bring to market in a true capitalist fashion, because the risk is always out there that, the market dominant player will drive you out of business. We've seen this in rare earths before. I've worked on a beryllium project at one point where, there's a producer in the US that makes 90% of the beryllium in the world. Do you really want to go toe to toe with them and think you're going to survive? Probably not. There are some good things coming though. One, we've got some deposits that could be developed. Saskatchewan Research Council, the next door province to me here, is currently building a rare earth processing facility right now, in the hopes that the materials will show up. So they're going to use some innovative processing routes. I think we'll see much better performance out of that than what we see out of China. But the other really exciting area is waste reprocessing. Rare earths, as you said, they're not rare. They're everywhere in low concentrations. So every high pressure acid leach tailings facility has rare earths in it. Every coal mine, the ash left over or the coal mine fines have rare earths. Bauxite residues have rare earths. So the reprocessing of those can actually give you a double win by recovering the small amounts that we need. It isn't huge amounts from those, and making those residues more environmentally responsible at the same time. And so there are some benefits there. We're now seeing scandium being recovered from, an aluminum facility in Canada, from a laterite facility in the Philippines, and it can be done more, and other rare earths can follow.
Well, again, I think scandium's getting some significant recycle, more than people realize already, but the other 16 aren't virtually getting any. And I think you're right. Recycle angle and even processing from other, ores, if you will, or ore tailings can really open this market up. But we need to push the technology down this. But honestly, we got to be willing to pay 5-10% more for a clean stream. And that's the part of this ESG discussion that I want to conclude on. Show me the business motivation for someone to pay a 1 or 2% extra for a clean copper or a clean REE. That, to me, seems to be the biggest missing component at this point. Jimmy, what's your take on that?
It's a great point, and it is truly hit the nail on the head. That is the driver. Are people willing to pay more for this better result down the road? Right. And as you know, it's been a struggle in certain metals, but I'd like to say there is some progress. I mean, one of the biggest things I can say is Pandora announced in the New York Times late January that they stopped using mined silver and gold. And they actually paid, I think, in the order of $10 million extra, as in premium for recycled material. So we're seeing finally a hardcore example of a major player's largest silver consumer saying, hey, look, we're paying money for this, higher valued material. I think we have a very long way to go for this to really be adopted. Right now, for example, we're working with, we have a mandate for PGM recycling vertical integration. And one of the biggest pushes of this integration is to have provenance tracking, ESG metrics recording, all on a sort of immutable record under blockchain for the ultimate use end of having a premium product. And a premium product has to be defined, right? What is the savings of carbon by using this product, right? Or what is the amount of electricity used in this product versus another one? So I think as we move along with better technology and better innovation and better sort of recording of the classic scope 1, 2, 3, I think we'll be at a point where we're not just asking for a premium like we've been asking for a long time. Sure, artisanal gold miners, they deserve that premium, right? They're working harder. Their lives are shorter. Their bodies are being destroyed through these chemicals. But we have to go past that and provide real raw data. And I think we're getting there. This Pandora story can't be under sort of expressed of how important that is. Because
we should all be paying a premium for recycled metals, right? I don't care what the metal is. The emissions and the impact doing it the second time around is so much smaller than the first time around. It's profound, and it doesn't matter which metal. And REs included. I think we really need to invest. There's some pretty cool things with powder metallurgy on magnets where you can basically reform magnets, next generation magnets, or even stronger Gauss, stronger magnetic strength than the original material. Those are the sorts of paths that I think are really going to help create some breakthrough. But you got to have a consumer willing to pay a little bit extra for that higher, class product and an ecologically less damaging product. And that's the part I'm missing. Lyle, what are your concluding thoughts here, sir? Let's bring this to a close.
I think that's really important. The challenge of recycling is twofold as I see it. One, the recycled streams are often blended in. So, for example, I helped start up the Stillwater Base Metals Refinery in Montana. They're a big palladium producer. They recycle lots of catalytic converters through the smelter. Right. That material gets blended with the fresh material coming out of the mine, and it all goes through the PGM, the base metals, and then off to a PGM refinery, and it is no longer distinct material. And so you've got this blended material, and it becomes challenging to really track and value that. And we may need to see separate recycle chain set up in order to really appropriately track this. But it comes back down to, as Jimmy said, you got to have the traceability for that. And that's really important. The other aspect is everybody really wants to make the recycled materials a large part of our future. And that's great. It's going to happen. But when you're in a growing market, like, for example, with EV batteries, you can recycle all the EV batteries and it isn't going to be a significant factor on nickel demand for 30 years. Right, because these batteries are going to last 15 years, and then maybe they go into a second use as grid storage for another 10, and then they make it back to the supply chain. And in the meantime, the demand for nickel has grown by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4 in those batteries. And so even when you bring all that back, it's a few percent. So until you get a stable demand profile, you're not going to have recycled being the dominant part of that, right? These metals, the beautiful thing about metals, though, unlike so many other materials that we use in our lives, is they're infinitely recyclable. They are pure at the atomic level, and you can make those atoms come around again and again and again, and they're the same atom every time. And so, whether it's nickel or aluminum or copper, all of these, they happen to go into service for very long times. Your transmission cables, you're not getting the aluminum back from those anytime soon. But when it comes back, it's fully 100% recyclable.
Fantastic. You guys, thank you for this really wide-ranging conversation. I thought we covered a lot of ground. I thank you both for your time, Jimmy and Lyle. Thank you so much. As we wrap up, I just want to highlight next week, I've got the famous Mr. Bart Mellick from TD Security.
Oh, yes.
So Bart will be talking about copper, the electrification metal. So please join us again next week. This is Matt Watson with Green Rush, mining the energy revolution. We'll see you next week. Take care, everybody.
Green Rush, mining the energy revolution with Matt Watson.